A century ago, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet. In this series, I will go in search of Britain's imperial past.
I have found gold.
And uncover its legacies. How did a small island on the edge of Europe end up dominating the world?
He turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates.
From its proudest achievements to its most shameful failures.
We're ripped away from Mother Africa into a strange land.
And how has the history of empire transformed Britain?
We became the black people of Britain.
On this journey, I uncover the extraordinary story of the biggest empire that the world has ever seen. In this program, I'm going to explore how the lure of Africa's wealth drew the empire into a shameful war. Here, surviving more than 100 years, original barbed wire, and a century of racial oppression. Followed by the rise of Africa's most famous revolutionary. I met Mandela once when he was here in London visiting as President of South Africa. Sat with Her Majesty the Queen, two heads of state lunching together on level terms. And I thought, what an achievement by a man who was imprisoned for much of his adult life, having fought for equal rights for black South Africans. How did the immoral system of apartheid emerge from the colonization of Africa?
The idea of subordinating black people and making them into a vassal class does not start after 1948.
And what part did the British Empire play in its creation? I was a child when I first heard stories of the Zulu Wars. Heroic young British soldiers in red tunics and pith helmets, battling an overwhelming onslaught of fierce African warriors, waging war against the British Empire. Africa was the last great frontier for Europe's empire builders. A dark continent, forbidding and dangerous, that nonetheless promised enormous riches to those who dared to penetrate its vast, uncharted wilderness. The cliché that I grew up with hides a far more complex story. The scramble for control over Africa would face the British Empire with its biggest challenge, whose consequences would shape South Africa, Britain, and the Empire. Within 50 years of arriving in southern Africa, the British had seized land controlled by the Dutch and established two new colonies, Cape Colony on the southern tip and the colony of Natal, which the British annexed in 1843. This is its capital, Pietermaritzburg, in KwaZulu-Natal, and here the footprint of empire is plain to see. The great survivor. I had not expected to find the Queen Empress Victoria still here, her statue untoppled, ungraffitied, but also I notice uncleaned. The grand civic buildings reminiscent of Manchester or Glasgow, and even the common postbox, stand as reminders of how the British constructed a familiar world in an alien terrain. But why would British men and women want to travel across the world to southern Africa? Dr. Trevor Ngwane is from the University of Johannesburg.
This is an 19th century map, and it's titled The Colonizability of Africa. What is really amazing is here, where they're talking about which parts of Africa are easier to colonize and what should the colonizer look out for.
What factors are important in the ease of colonization?
They were worried about health conditions, tropical disease like malaria. So they say, you know, if you go there, you're going at your own peril. But also the friendliness or not of the natives. So they would say things like, don't go there, they are warlike.
All of this territory was considered to be freely available to European powers.
Yeah, I think they just thought it was their, I don't know, divine right to take over Africa.
On paper, southern Africa might have looked unusually hospitable to the colonists, but its land was already home to a large indigenous population. How the white settlers proceeded to overpower the black population, seizing land and power, is central to South Africa's imperial history. The garrison at Fort Napier, established by the British when they seized Natal, overlooks Pietermaritzburg. Troops were stationed here during some of the most notorious wars in African history.
The song is about the spear, yeah.
That sort of song would have been sung in battle?
Not necessarily in battle, but it would be sung as the soldiers are drilling.
Umbozo Khoza's ancestor led 20,000 Zulu warriors against imperial troops at Isandlwana. As the British cut a swathe across southern Africa, the indigenous population fought to protect its lands. The wars fought by the Zulu kingdom have become celebrated legend. The Zulus have passed into British history as being very brave and very fierce.
Yes.
But would you say also that they were peace-loving?
I would really say we were peaceful until we got provoked. The challenge was the mission. The mission was to colonize. I think the leaders, they thought they were gonna just like having a walk on the park because they had guns. Only to find that these guys were really prepared to die for their land. The thing that they were fighting for was the future of their heritage and their culture.
The political and military strength of the Zulu people blocked the expansion of Britain's colonies in southern Africa. In 1879, imperial forces massed on its border, primed to invade. But within days, a British force sent into Zulu territory was overwhelmed at Isandlwana as 20,000 Zulu warriors countered the threat.
You can imagine 20,000 regiments singing in unison. But they all step on one pulse. It's like they could count, like bars, 1, 2, 3, 4, and like intimidating the regiments from Britain. And as they were getting closer and starting to shoot, they were already finished.
So Zulus with weapons like these?
Yes.
The British with these. Tell me about this weapon.
This one is Martin Henry. It was able to kill at least 5 people per bullet.
Tell me then, how are the Zulus able to fight with this against this?
I think it was a matter of understanding first the methods of the British Army, because these were taking 1 bullet. So you can imagine the commander says, fire! And then, boo, 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 and then they say, cease fire. And then they're taking like different positions in the other row. As they're busy doing that, the Zulus would be faster finishing them.
The Zulus were ready to die for their land. But indigenous Africans could not prevail. And there would be a new wave of settlers who uncovered the extraordinary wealth of Africa deep in its soil.
I have found gold.
Early British settlers saw southern Africa as a vast and alien land that needed their civilizing influence.
After Natal became a colony, the British established a governor in this fine house. He was, of course, responsible to the Queen's ministers in London. But at a time when messages could take months to arrive, urgent matters were often settled locally.
The governor's first task was to seed the colony with British settlers who would manage the land and its population. Among those who seized the opportunity were ancestors of Robert King.
When did your family arrive in South Africa?
On the 10th of October, 1849.
And who was that?
That was my great-great-grandparents, John and Janet King, and Janet's spinster sisters, and a bachelor brother, James Ellis.
Any idea how arduous their journey was?
It was a terrible journey out. It lasted 3 months, and they came out in an old whaler that leaked the whole way.
For many people in Britain, facing high levels of unemployment and poverty at home, migration to the colonies offered a new life and the chance to prosper.
What was the attraction of Africa, do you think?
Well, it was the Byrne immigration scheme and the fact that things in Europe were not good with the revolutions and potato blight.
And he had the chance here of a chunk of land.
Yes, and improving and making himself independent.
Robert's family came to Natal with the help of a scheme set up in 1849 by Joseph Byrne, a speculator who promised passage to this new world and cheap land. But they were to discover that his promises were overblown.
To quote from James King's memoirs, "We were dumped on the veldt one afternoon in May 1850. The weather was fine but cold, and the only covering overhead was a large waterproof tarpaulin set up on poles. The farm was quite unimproved, and it was the edge of civilization as far as Natal was concerned." Joseph Byrne thought he'd make a successful profit out of it. Of course, it turned out to be a failure.
What was your family's view of Joseph Byrne and his scheme?
Oh, they certainly thought he was a swindler. They were allocated 20 acres, which was insufficient for farming here in southern Africa. And it's also an issue when you think that this wasn't empty land that was taken over. It was, in many senses, stolen from the indigenous people.
How was it during the 19th century that a small white minority was able to govern a large black majority?
They had guns. The way they eventually controlled them politically was another matter altogether. Natal, as a British colony, recognised that everyone had the right to the vote. However, you had to have a certain amount of income and the other thing to be able to read and write English. In Natal, it meant that very few Africans got the vote.
Britain, in its home policy, didn't have to deal with the colour of skins. So the rights of the races, how and where they lived, were decided here.
As the number of migrants increased and the colony expanded, the white minority devised rules to control and subdue the black majority. They were corralled in native reserves and employed in jobs that no white man wanted.
There are some 200 so-called mountains like this, made not of gold dust, but dust from gold mines. They represent 150 years of spoil, still scarring the landscape today.
Millions of tons of dirt were ripped from the earth during the sinking of vast mines like this.
Well, it was a bright day at the surface, but we descend into the damp, murky depths and going down just about 75 meters. Some guys had to go down 3,000 meters to find their gold.
With its diamonds and gold, Southern Africa was a place where fortunes could be made by those willing to risk everything.
Now, the business part of the mine. Every day, each shaft at this mine received 3,000 men going down on the morning shift. There were 15 shafts, 45,000 men working this mine alone. And they came to conditions like this. The gold is always at an angle from north to south. They carve into it and they push that week by week, month by month in that direction. The face where they worked, no more than a meter high, so they were bent double or lying on their back to work, with the constant threat that the roof might tumble in, might crush a hand or a leg and put them out of work.
Hundreds and thousands of black workers toiling in gold mines enabled a handful of white men to become the richest people in Southern Africa and among the wealthiest in the empire. One was Cecil Rhodes, who at the age of 17 was sent to work on his brother's cotton farm in Natal. His ascent to wealth was spectacular, and he shaped not just Southern Africa, but the British Empire across the continent.
In 1887, a year after gold was discovered, Cecil Rhodes chose this site for the Rand Club. It was to exhibit all the elegance and exclusivity that a British gentleman would expect wherever he might find himself in the world. Rhodes had grown cotton in Natal, made a fortune in diamonds, and now he turned his attention to gold.
Here in Johannesburg, the most powerful and wealthy men did deals and redrew the map of British Africa. Brian McKenzie is chairman of the Rand Club's House Committee.
What a very splendid building it is.
Thank you very much.
Tell me about its design.
So the inspiration for the club was taken from the Reform Club in London, and the idea really being that it's a piece of London in the sort of dry, dusty, upstart Transvaal.
I hear this expression, the Rand Lords. What does it mean?
It's really the wealthy mining magnates at the founding of Johannesburg, and these people had incredible, lavish lifestyles.
So just how exclusive was the Rand Club in its early days?
It was terribly exclusive. To become a member, you had to be proposed and seconded. And once you had been proposed and seconded, your name would then go onto a list, and the list would be put up at the front of the clubhouse, and there were black balls next to your name. And if your name got, I think, 3 black balls, you weren't allowed to become a member.
What kind of qualifications do you think you needed? Was this about pedigree? Was it about money? Was it about ethics?
Joburg was an upstart town, so I think money was really the thing that spoke.
Almost overnight, Southern Africa's wealth was in the hands of an unlikely collection of men.
Let's start with Cecil Rhodes. We know about his wealth and power, but he started as a sickly young man from Bishop Stortford, who came out here for reasons of health. His main business partner was Charles Rudd, another rather sickly youth, although in his days at Cambridge, he was quite a useful sportsman. Perhaps the most surprising, a Jewish Cockney boy, Barney Banato. He had at one time made his living as a prize fighter and as a juggler, but he had real business acumen. Here's Solly Joel, son of a publican, but once described as the richest young man in Britain. He put his money into racehorses and bought the Drury Lane Theatre. And finally, John Dale Lace. He was born in the Isle of Man, said to be the most handsome member of the club and the best dressed. And what became of his wealth? Well, his wife took milk baths in a marble tub.
Gold had given the Rand Lords absolute power over the empire's southern African colonies.
By contrast with having wealth in the United Kingdom, for example, at that time in southern Africa, you not only had the money, but you had control of human beings.
It was quite shocking control. Rhodes was in the diamond diggings in Kimberley, and he was asked when he looked over the diggings, did he see money, did he see wealth? And his response was he saw power. And, you know, Rhodes really had this vision that he wanted to paint Africa in British red. So you would have this vast tract of red all the way from Cape to Cairo, and really expand the British Empire, which I think was something that was a very popular view at the turn of the century.
A few millionaires wielded extraordinary financial and political power, and most significantly, controlled a vast number of people. The black population that had stood in the way of colonial expansion was harnessed to work for the white bosses. But how could so few rule so many? Dr. Trevor Ngwane is a specialist in workers' rights.
I would say that no one wanted to come to the mines. There was brutality, there was violence, there was racism, but many men found that in order to survive, they had to supplement their livelihood with coming to the mines.
And what kind of wages might they expect here, do you think?
Very low wages. The mine owners pushed a very hard bargain.
Were there any opportunities for self-improvement amongst the miners?
Well, there was a rigid race caliber, so certain jobs were out of bounds for black workers. And even if the mine owners wanted to promote black workers, they had a problem because the white workers felt threatened by black workers. But in any case, keeping black workers without any career options cheapened their labor. So the mine owners preferred that.
Gold had secured Britain's imperial might over people and land. But imperial greed would cause appalling damage to British prestige. On the eve of the 20th century, Britain's hunger for gold triggered one of the bloodiest and most expensive conflicts in the history of the empire, embroiling British forces in a demoralizing guerrilla war.
I wouldn't call it murderous, but I would call it callous.
The empire's expansion across southern Africa was a highly profitable business. Gold and diamonds created enormous wealth, but in the end, there was a cost. Buildings like this, scattered across the South African landscape, are the legacy of a bloody war sparked by the empire's greed.
So, hands and knees the only way to get in. Immediately I'm struck by the thickness of the walls. They really are tremendous. These places must have been hugely expensive to build, and they took an average of 3 months. Normally these blockhouses had a machine gun emplacement. I don't see any sign of one here, but certainly lots of slits where riflemen could be positioned standing on ladders. And here I perceive the reason why the blockhouse was built in this position. It was to overlook the railway, tremendously important to the British to control these tracks.
As early British colonists had advanced across southern Africa, descendants of the original Dutch settlers, known as Boers, had retreated inland and settled two self-governing republics. They couldn't know that they had chosen some of the most valuable land in Africa. To understand how decades of hostility between the British and the Boers escalated into a bloody war in which more than 70,000 men, women, and children died, I'm talking to historian Roger Webster.
Paint me a picture of the Boer. The word means farmer.
Farmer, yes. The average farmer read one book, and that was the Bible. Okay, and he took that literally, and he believed that God had given him the land to live off, and that's how he lived. They didn't like the British one iota. They found them untrustworthy. And in some ways they were, because, you know, whether one likes it or not, if you look at history, They were the spin doctors of the world.
Thinking now about the South African War, why does the Boer leader Kruger declare war on the British?
Because he was fully aware of the fact that Britain wanted to invade. And the reason why he knew it is he watched what the British did in Zululand in 1879 at Isandlwana and Ulundi. They wanted the war, okay? Why? Because they wanted Zululand. And that's exactly how it was engineered. Now, they did exactly the same to Kruger. They amassed forces on his border, and Kruger says, if you do not withdraw your troops within 10 days, I'm going to declare war. And this is what he does. And Chamberlain stands up in Parliament in Britain and waves the telegram and says, gentlemen, we've done it. We've made them go to war. So that was all planned beforehand to get fingers on the gold.
In 1899, when the South African War, as it's now known, began, the British felt confident of swift victory. After all, the Boers were farmers, not military men, and were not expected to fight back effectively.
How do you think the Boer fighting against the British were able to hold out for so long?
Well, firstly, being a farmer, they were expert marksmen. Secondly, they were expert horsemen, and they knew the country, whereas the British didn't. They were aware of the terrain, but they didn't know all the nooks and crannies and where to duck and where to hide, because you'd get situations, particularly in a terrain like this, where they just disappear because they knew exactly where to go.
With the arrival of reinforcements, British commanders believed victory was in their sights. But their traditional military skills were of little use against the tactics deployed by the Boers. The British found themselves mired in a guerrilla war.
Are the South Africans fighting on because of gold?
Yes, the wealth of the country. You know, those are the richest gold mines that the world's ever seen.
As guerrilla attacks continued month after month, the British built more than 8,000 blockhouses, spread over 3,500 miles to fence in and eliminate the Boer commandos.
The British High Commissioner said, why don't we build lines of blockhouses to hem these Boers in and use the barbed wire? And what they would do is they would roll out the barbed wire and put cans and bells on them, so that if anybody interfered with it, they could hear it in the blockhouse.
You have to imagine this blockhouse and many others, connected by hundreds of miles of barbed wire, serving to enclose thousands of Boers so they couldn't get out and cause trouble for the British. And here are the cement footings of the posts that held the barbed wire, and here, surviving more than 100 years, original barbed wire.
Throughout the conflict, with every assault against them, the Boers' defiance grew, and they refused to surrender.
The response was to burn the farms and round up the population, men, women, and children, reviving an old military tactic of scorched earth and developing a modern one of the concentration camp.
For centuries, military strategists had scorched the earth to destroy crops, homes, and infrastructure which the enemy could use to survive. Under Lord Kitchener, the British set out to break Boer resistance. Nearly 30,000 homesteads were razed to the ground. The fields were torched and livestock slaughtered as troops cleared the land of Boer and black African civilians. The war then became one of the most shaming episodes in British history.
Here at Heidelberg, near Johannesburg, the British built concentration camps, mainly for women and children, a few men, and black Africans. 100 such camps appeared across the country. The scorched earth policy was brutal, but Britain's neglect of its prisoners was far more deadly.
In 1900, the British began to round up and transport Boer and black civilians to camps, where they would live in appalling conditions behind barbed wire. This cemetery records the tragedy that unfolded in the concentration camps. Historian Dr. Lindy Courts has studied how the empire applied this inhumane policy.
Camps were at first established for men who were called the so-called hensoppers, or the hands-uppers, people who had surrendered, and their families. But then as the scorched earth policy comes about, you have destitute families whose farms had been destroyed, and they then join these camps. And then as the countryside is swept, the numbers grow.
The numbers grow to what?
Close to 100,000 people in the end.
And in what sorts of condition?
Terrible. Here you have a Boer family in one of their tents. And what I find very striking is the mother. Look at her face.
Yes.
You see, very gaunt, very strained. But you also see the strain on the children. By the time they had reached the camps, they had witnessed things that one would not want a child to witness. Many of them had witnessed battles, because in the early phases of the war, many of the Boers actually took their wives and children with them on commando to protect them from the British. So these children witnessed the battles. They witnessed the violence of their homes being burnt. So that trauma stayed with many of them. The amount of babies who died from dehydration, from heat exhaustion, from being kept on open cattle trucks, open wagons, in the extreme heat, to arrive at these camps and there's nothing for them.
Is this then, in your view, a murderous policy or an incompetent policy?
I wouldn't call it murderous, but I would call it callous. Kitchener, it was well known, was no friend of women at all. So their pleas for their conditions and their children's conditions, that fell on deaf ears.
45 such camps were erected for Boer civilians, and a further 66 for black Africans. Polluted water, hunger, infectious diseases, and exposure to the elements all contributed to the horrifying death toll in the camps.
I imagine that the atrocities of empire were committed because the colonists had unfettered power over people that they regarded as inferior, because they were very far from the scrutiny of those who might hold them to account. Back home, a British sense of decency had been less corrupted by imperialism. If the British Empire had a conscience that could be pricked, it was to be found there.
A Cornish suffragette and pacifist, Emily Hobhouse, heard of these concentration camps. Concerned by the plight of the imprisoned families, she travelled to South Africa. She wrote, "Thousands physically unfit are kept in conditions of life that they have not the strength to endure." Since the outset of the war, Hobhouse had campaigned for a peaceful settlement. Now her mission turned to improving conditions for the thousands of Boer women and children in the British camps.
Emily Hobhouse exposed what was going on in South Africa to the British public. And her exposing it was actually an enormous embarrassment to the British government. But they had this investigated, and that led to measures being taken to improve the conditions in the camps. And from there on, the mortality rate actually began dropping.
The changes implemented because of Hobhouse saved white lives, though still nearly 28,000 Boers died during internment. More than 15,000 black Africans also died in the camps. What has been the legacy for the Afrikaner people of all of this?
In terms of our political legacy, this, like nothing else, was an impetus to Afrikaner nationalism and one of the most horrific policies of discrimination in the 20th century.
To what extent were those horrendous policies we're referring to apartheid based on a legacy from the British Empire?
It was a continuation of a colonial order. I would take it as far back as the Dutch, actually. But then the British come along and they add further segregationist measures to that. So it's a policy on which everyone was, they were all building on this, they were all contributing to this.
The war was ruinously expensive for the British, but the bigger cost was to the reputation of the British Empire. It struggled over years to beat small, irregular forces, and the tactics used to win horrified public opinion at home and abroad. The South Africans, having been so badly treated, won a sort of moral victory alongside their military defeat. And when it came to sitting down to devise the Union of South Africa a few years later, they, and not the British, held the high ground. For decades, British rule in southern Africa had relied on white domination. But as the new century dawned, racial division would undermine the empire's legitimacy in bitter struggles that have left their mark on South Africa today. Late one night in June 1893, an Indian lawyer, newly arrived in Natal, was travelling by train from Durban on behalf of a client. Shortly before the train pulled into Pietermaritzburg, his ticket was checked. Even as the holder of a first-class ticket, with his brown face, he was ordered to move to third class. When he refused, this British subject, a London-trained barrister, was thrown off. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, one day to become Mahatma Gandhi.
Stung with indignation, having been hurled from the train, Gandhi came to the telegraph office and sent cables to his friends and to the railway company. They were probably the first words of many millions that he would write during 21 years in South Africa.
The abolition of slavery in the 1830s triggered a labour shortage across Europe's colonies. But within the British Empire, armies of workers could be moved from one colony to another. Thousands of Indians flocked to Natal to work as indentured labourers on its sugar plantations. This migration, which Gandhi witnessed, would create further racial complexity and tension in southern Africa, and a political challenge to the empire which crossed continents. David Gengen is from the Gandhi Memorial Committee.
When Gandhi has been thrown off the train, what's going through his mind?
He felt that everybody who's a British citizen should enjoy the same rights wherever they were in the world, and he found when he came to South Africa that that was not happening. Legislation was then being passed to restrict the movement of Indians. In fact, there were certain territories in South Africa where Indian people couldn't even reside.
This is interesting. Already there are restrictions on Indians as to where they live and how they can work, decades and decades before apartheid.
British control of southern Africa relied on white power over black. The newly arrived Indian population was slotted into a racial hierarchy between the whites and blacks as second-class citizens. Even a highly educated British subject like Gandhi would be judged by his colour rather than his qualifications.
What did Gandhi decide to do?
He began to organize people. In 1894, he established the first formal political formation in South Africa, which was the Natal Indian Congress, which was a precursor to the African National Congress, the ruling party today. So people then had a forum in which to protest some of the actions that actually happened.
This is interesting because he's a British subject, he's a middle-class figure, he's well off, and he's working on behalf of Indians, people of Indian heritage living in South Africa. Does he care much about the black people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because he came obviously to fight a particular case, right? The cause was mainly around the Indian issues, but in his later writings, I mean, he made this point that because South Africa was part of the British colony, that the indigenous African population had the same rights as British citizens.
Today, racism is almost universally condemned. But at the end of the 19th century, in many societies, racial hierarchies were taken for granted. It wasn't just Europeans who had this idea that they were ethnically superior. The moral standards of today are completely different from those of history.
Gandhi believed that the British Empire had betrayed its colonial subjects by making them unequal. His act of defiance didn't sweep away the divisions that had become entrenched under colonial rule, but it did help to lay the foundations for a revolutionary movement. In 1948, the all-white government formalized decades of social and political segregation in the laws of apartheid. It would not be dismantled until Nelson Mandela and the ANC led the majority population to replace white rule. Was apartheid the inevitable result of the British presence in southern Africa? Professor Nyasha Umboti from the University of Johannesburg has a very clear view that they are linked.
The apartheid originates in the British Empire. The idea of subordinating black people and making them into a vassal class does not start after 1948. The Zulus, who have been defeated, who have been dispossessed, they say, let's put them into reserves. Let's put them into locations where they can become a reservoir of labor for white farms, for white mining areas and so on. And so they're supposed to live in those reserves.
Was there a moment where there could have been a liberal democracy established? Was the moment 1910? Was the moment missed then?
Could we have a liberal democracy in 1910? Absolutely not, because black people were in the majority, easily outnumbering white people. So in a democracy, if you are going to give all of them the vote, then they were going to be in power. So how could you then make those people part of a constitutional or liberal democracy? That would have been very inconvenient to the system that was being set up.
If this is the funeral of the British Empire and you're asked to write the epitaph, what do you say?
I'll say good riddance, but the scars are still with us. They are in our minds, they are in our hearts, they are in our psyche. South Africa right now is the most unequal society in the world. 1 in 2 South Africans are living in poverty right now. There's 30 million out of a population of 60 million. And generations will still have to deal with this monster that is empire.
The Apartheid Museum records decades of legally enshrined racism and segregation. Apartheid did not happen overnight. It built on, consolidated, and perfected practices established under British colonial rule, indeed from the moment that settlers first arrived. That is a distressing and humbling thought if you're British, indeed if you're white. The people I've met here have shown me that the country's history is being reconsidered to include African perspectives excluded until now. I found myself learning a lot about South Africa's past, and indeed painfully about that of my own country.
In the next programme, how the dream of a new England was swept away by the greatest rebellion in British history.
We wanted to be as British as you guys.
How dangerous was this activity for the spies?
You paid with your life.
And how a new vision of empire rose from the ashes.
This country was built on the backs of these children.
A century ago, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet. In this series, I will go in search of Britain's imperial past.
I have found gold.
And uncover its legacies. How did a small island on the edge of Europe end up dominating the world?
He turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates.
From its proudest achievements to its most shameful failures.
We're ripped away from Mother Africa into a strange land.
And how has the history of empire transformed Britain?
We became the black people of Britain.
On this journey, I uncover the extraordinary story of the biggest empire that the world has ever seen. In this program, I discover how Britain's empire was built by pirates.
They were given permission from the King of England to plunder, and plunder they did.
How millions were ripped from their homelands and stripped of their identities.
I cannot say exactly where I'm from. I just can't trace that back.
And how the descendants of those men and women altered Britain. The trade in enslaved Africans, uprooting millions from their homeland and transporting them across the Atlantic, drove the early development of the British Empire. At the empire's sunset, the descendants of some of those slaves gravitated towards Britain at the empire's heart. Another migration, another adaptation for them, but this time changing Britain into the multicultural country that it is today. This is the story of a tiny island that redefined what it means to be British. Jamaica, the Caribbean island of lush green mountains, coral reef beaches, and sleepy fishing villages. A small tropical country that plays an outsized part in Britain's imperial history. And here, beneath the waves of Kingston Harbour, an extraordinary piece of empire lies hidden. The lost city of Port Royal. On the 7th of June 1692, 2,000 people died when the sandy peninsula on which Port Royal was built slid into the sea during an earthquake. The impact can still be seen today underwater. Barnacled walls mark out the edges of forgotten streets. You can just make out the rooms in which people lived over 300 years ago. People whose lives were unexpectedly cut short. The town lies beneath the water now, preserved like a submarine Pompeii, yielding insights into how the British exercised mastery of the seas at the opening of their imperial adventure. Who were these early empire builders and why did they come to a remote island so far from home? Doric Gray is the former executive director of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust.
Port Royal literally sits on a sand spit. And when the earthquake occurred, there was a process of liquefaction. The sand turned quicksand, and the buildings went down vertically. The walls fell in on some, and some of the other walls fell out. It's also a burial site. 2,000 people died instantly. What happened on that day, on the 7th of June, 1692, is locked in a time capsule underwater.
Why is this town underwater so valuable to our understanding of those times?
In 37 years, Port Royal became the most important English city in the Americas. So most of the site is preserved. It is still there. There's still a lot of information that we can learn. about not only Jamaica, but about ourselves.
The sunken city is slowly yielding its secrets, including the surprising identity of those who transformed England into an imperial power. In the middle of the 17th century, Spain, with its extensive colonies, was the world's superpower. Spain dominated the Americas, whereas England had only a few trading posts in North America and the Caribbean, all of them private ventures. But that was about to change under the leadership of a man with a plan.
Oliver Cromwell, having beheaded and replaced the English king, sent the first English state-sponsored colonial expedition across the Atlantic with the aim of seizing those parts of its empire that a now decaying Spain could not defend.
The first piece of land captured from the Spanish was Jamaica in 1655. The indigenous Taino had been all but wiped out, and there were barely 2,000 people on the island. Peter Gordon is a former officer in the Jamaican Coast Guard. In Port Royal, his family goes back generations.
The British didn't waste any time in building this fort because they had taken it so easily from the Spaniards, they didn't want the same thing happening to them. So they almost immediately, within a year, build this fort.
It was one thing to seize Jamaica, another to hold it. This new colony needed sea power to protect it. As England's navy was overstretched, the task was outsourced to an unlikely quarter.
Having expelled the Spanish from Port Royal, the English feared a counterattack, which they were ill-equipped to repel. The resourceful first governor, Edward D'Oyly, had a solution. He invited buccaneers from nearby Tortuga, present-day Haiti, to make the town their home port, from which these Spanish-hating pirates could harass Spain. Peter, tell me about these buccaneers that were brought in by Edward D'Oyly.
I'm afraid most people tend to regard them as pirates. I willingly embrace them as buccaneers because I know they were given permission from the King of England to plunder. And plunder they did.
Did these people have a particular grudge against Spain?
Everybody had a grudge against Spain because she wanted to keep everybody off these lands.
We romanticize pirates from Peter Pan to Pirates of the Caribbean, but actually they were a very bloodthirsty lot.
They did what they had to do to enrich themselves. They could do as they pleased, and they did.
A license to kill.
Exactly.
When the English gave these pirates the mark, the stamp of official approval, was there any limitation to what these guys could do?
Well, in the case of Morgan, there was absolutely none. The man took full advantage.
Henry Morgan was the pirate master of the smash and grab. On behalf of England's start-up empire, Morgan tormented the Spanish, weakening the threat that they posed to Britain's imperial ambitions.
And how do you Jamaicans feel about this, this huge figure with a lot of scallywag running through him?
We are of different stock here in Port Royal. We embrace Henry Morgan because many of us, generations through the years, came out of these cutthroats and robbers.
Henry Morgan transformed the fortunes of Port Royal. On one raid alone, he brought back the equivalent today of £155 million. Port Royal became a powerful English naval base. and with its riches gained a reputation as the wickedest city on earth.
Fundamentally, British Jamaica was founded on theft. It had been seized from the Spanish, and they in turn before that had grabbed it. And Jamaica depended on buccaneers who were violent for its defense and its economy.
By the time Port Royal was drowned by earthquake and tidal wave, a new age was dawning. The empire was turning away from piracy and the theft of gold to the plunder of human beings. Enslavement on an industrial scale. After Port Royal, dubbed the wickedest city on earth, was sunk by earthquake, a new chapter in the history of empire began, with Jamaica at its center. The old Port Royal dockyard became the headquarters of the British Navy in the Caribbean. It would become one of the biggest naval bases in the world. These old buildings evoke that imperial past.
This old naval hospital is quite recent when you think how far the Royal Navy's connection with Jamaica goes. Built in 1818 and making use of the most modern technology, an iron-framed building. And the extraordinary thing is how it has survived numerous earthquakes, any number of hurricanes, although in fact a hurricane in the 1980s left it pretty dilapidated and destroyed the outer buildings. Early in its existence, the Royal Navy discovered the importance of having naval surgeons and even hospital ships to treat scurvy and injuries and dehydration. And then when they came to the tropics, they would suffer from malaria and yellow fever, and the men would be treated in wards like this. And you can be absolutely assured that many a Royal Navy sailor breathed his last in this room.
At the end of the 17th century, the Royal Navy was on a path to becoming the world's most powerful sea force. For the brigands and scoundrels who'd done Britain's dirty work on the high seas, time was running out.
One of the last English pirates of the Caribbean was John Ratton, alias Calico Jack, credited with being the inventor of that symbol of piracy, the Jolly Roger. In 1720, he was captured, brought to the Admiralty Court of Port Royal, and hanged. His body was then suspended in chains at the entrance to the harbour, at a place now known as Ratton's Quay, as a warning to everyone that piracy, which had once been endorsed by the British authorities, was now strictly prohibited.
The beginning of the end for the pirates had come with the Treaty of Madrid in 1670. This was a watershed moment for the empire because the Spanish recognized England's American colonies. But the price to be paid was to end the use of anti-Spanish pirates. I've come to meet historian Jonathan Greenland to ask how such a deal could be done between imperial rivals.
The Spanish suddenly decide that they have to come to peace with England because the privateering and the piracy were wrecking their economy. They gave England a sweet deal. They basically said, but we recognize all your territories in the Western Hemisphere as long as you stop this piracy.
Having agreed to end piracy, did they actually do so?
Yes, they hung quite a lot of pirates, anybody who was caught in the act, because suddenly they discovered something even better than piracy. Sugar. People were making far more from sugar than they would be making from piracy anymore. Far more.
Sugar cane, first brought to the Caribbean by Christopher Columbus himself, thrived in the tropical conditions of Jamaica, with its plentiful supply of sun and rain. The fertile land would be a magnet to those willing to risk their lives to make their fortunes.
I'm approaching Stokes Hall. Luke Stokes had been governor of Nevis, another Caribbean colony. But after the fall of Port Royal to the British, he spied an opportunity in Jamaica. In an extraordinary piece of logistical organisation, he arrived with 1,600 people. But adventuring in the tropics was a risky business, and Stokes and his wife soon succumbed to disease.
Stokes had chosen to settle in the east, in the area of the Plantain Garden River, one of the most fertile in Jamaica. But the conditions that made it good for sugarcane also made it a breeding ground for the mosquito. 2/3 of the 1,600 people who came with Luke Stokes would die from malaria and yellow fever. For the early colonists, this was also a lawless land.
Coming to Jamaica, I didn't expect to find anything as old as this and as substantial. It feels like a baronial hall. It also has the feeling of being defensible territory. The thing has the feel of a castle. Of course, to resist hurricanes and earthquakes, you'd want great thick walls, but these are enormous. And while it's true that a proper castle wouldn't have windows, what proper castles do have are arrow slits. And here are slits all over the place. Not for arrows, of course, but a place where maybe a person could position himself with a gun and resist those who were coming up the hill.
Despite the risks of this frontier territory, the lure of sugar was irresistible. Sugar was the developed world's new drug. And as the appetite for tea took off, so did the craze to sweeten it. One man who saw the business potential was Henry Morgan. The same Henry Morgan who'd amassed a fortune in piracy. Jonathan Greenland has offered to show me the inventory of Morgan's possessions at the time of his death.
Henry Morgan was a self-made man. He went from being a soldier to becoming a pirate. Then he eventually became Governor General of Jamaica. And then his last chapter of his life, he became a very successful sugar planter. A lot of it is sort of borne out by this inventory. This is an inventory of Henry Morgan's property. The most important things are the amount of stuff he had. A lot of jewelry, a lot of, things which, just demonstrated wealth, gold and silver. And then he also had a velvet saddle. I don't know whether that would be very much use. And then more kind of interestingly here, 44 Negro men, 42 Negro women.
And they, of course, these people are just listed amongst his other properties.
They are just listed as property, exactly.
And why was the combination of sugar and slavery so extraordinarily lucrative for people like Henry Morgan?
People like Henry Morgan could, purchase human beings at price and then have them as their personal property. And then they would work their plantations and make a lot of money.
Sugar made such commercial pioneers wealthy. But it also set up a triangular trade that enriched and empowered the emerging empire. Jamaica's sugar molasses was shipped to Britain, and the profits were used to purchase goods to take to West Africa. Those were bartered for enslaved Africans, who were transported to the Caribbean and sold to Jamaica's sugar planters. The system created vibrant colonial economies while filling the coffers of the British Crown. But what was the human cost? of this imperial trade. Professor Veront Satchel is an historian who's descended from enslaved Africans.
The vast majority would have been coming from the west of Africa, say from that area around Nigeria, Ghana.
Were they sold on arrival?
Yes, it would be advertised in the newspaper. You're having this auction, they would be auctioned off, and it would be done by scramble.
Scramble?
Yes. When the day of that auction would be taking place, the planters would be advised and they would go to the market, and at an opportune time, the slaves would be placed onto, say, a platform. And the planters would just rush up and grab a number, or just bundle a number of slaves. That's scramble.
You're kidding.
So that would be, and that can be traumatic, isn't it?
Describe the life of enslaved people on an estate like this one.
Wow. If the slave finds himself or herself working in the fields, their work would be extremely difficult because they would have to be plowing with their hoes the stiff soil just to prepare the soil. And that's backbreaking. Backbreaking.
All of this, the slave trade, slavery, wars, all driven by the sweet tooth in Europe.
All driven by the sweet tooth in Europe. That is the power of sugar.
With rocketing demand for sugar across the globe, Jamaica became an engine room of empire, creating wealth and power for Britain. But it depended on violence and suppression, and therefore lived in fear of revolution. Jamaica, once the home of the indigenous Taino, looks very different today. Many of its population are descended from enslaved Africans, ripped from their homelands and stripped of their identity. The islanders are who they are as a result of empire. The story of how that came about is one of extraordinary economic success at woeful human cost. It's well illustrated here at the lavish and elegant Good Hope Estate. Here lived John Tharp, at the start of the 19th century, probably the richest man in Jamaica. Having inherited 2 estates from his father, he shrewdly amassed 10 enormous sugar plantations covering 16,000 acres with 3,000 enslaved workers. It was said, with a little exaggeration, that he could ride across the island without ever leaving his own land. This estate stands as a striking example of the extraordinary fortunes that could be created on the plantations. It may not be appropriate even to show appreciation for the architecture of a plantation owner whose estate depended on enslaved people, but this has been brilliantly created. The house expresses both its owner's status and taste. Bedrooms on the ground level, benefiting from the marvelous circulation of air. This floor, 200 years old, made of Jamaican orange wood and as good as the day it was laid. And here, a splendid map of Good Hope Estate, the parish of Trelawney, Jamaica, 1794. Here, the river, without which there would not have been a plantation because it gave power
to the mill. Here's the little bridge. So on one side would be the wheelhouse, the mill, and the factory.
The bridge, the river, and the wheelhouse are still here today. I'm meeting Jamaican heritage expert O'Shane Robinson to find out what life was like for those who toiled to create the sugar fueling the empire.
O'Shane, an enormous water wheel, and I suppose this was at the very heart of the sugar manufacturing process.
Yes, it's within these structures that the sugar cane would have been crushed so that the juice can be extracted and then transported over across the river.
Over that rather fine bridge?
Yes.
Where would the mill actually have been? Where would the turning pieces have been?
The mill is on the other side.
The mill is where the cane is crushed.
So in here you would have found the rollers, would you?
Yes, the rollers would have been like this, and the sugar cane would have been fed through it. The juice would have then been extracted.
Are we talking about a crowd of enslaved people in here?
Yes. Now imagine operating for close to 24 hours with little to no break, and you're there just pushing sugar cane to get all the juice out of the cane. And then one of your fingers accidentally get caught in the rollers. It would then pull you in. And as it pull you in, there would have been somebody on standby that would have a machete to sever your hand from your body so that the production would not stop, because production was valued more than the lives of the slaves.
Here at Good Hope, I begin to grasp the scale of what was required to meet the growing taste for sugar in Britain and the human cost. In 1662, 7 years after Jamaica had been conquered by the British, there were 554 enslaved people in the colony. Just over a century later, there were more than 400 times that number, more than 200,000 people in this island alone.
The success of the British Empire required the mass movement of peoples across the oceans. Starting in 1662, the British transported 3.5 million men and women from Africa across the Atlantic to be sold into slavery.
Had I looked down on one of the harbours on this coastline in the early 19th century, I might have seen up to 20 vessels at any one time, decanting their cargo of Africans who'd crossed the Atlantic in chains and loading sugar and rum bound for Britain and its empire.
That extensive colonial trade, based on slavery, was protected by Britain's extraordinary asset, the most powerful fleet in the world.
Slavery has been practiced throughout human history. Africans have enslaved other Africans. North African Barbary pirates put white Christians into bondage. Arab traders seized vast numbers of Africans and shipped them eastwards. The European abduction and transport of Africans across the Atlantic was truly massive and systemic, and in that sense, exceptional.
But increasingly, voices were raised against slavery. The transport and trade of enslaved people would be abolished throughout the British Empire in 1807, but slavery itself remained legal. There were sporadic rebellions in Jamaica and elsewhere. Reprisals were swift and brutal.
In the run-up to Christmas 1831, a rumour circulated that the king had at last decided to set free the enslaved people of his empire. And when that turned out not to be true, all hell broke loose here. It would be the most widespread rebellion in Caribbean slave history.
Tens of thousands of enslaved people set fire to plantations. White authority and the empire's livelihood were under attack. The uprising was blamed on the Baptist Church of Jamaica, founded by former enslaved Africans. Nearly 200 years ago, there was a small chapel where this modern church now stands. Lay preacher Leon Jackson can tell me about how its Baptist minister, William Knibb, led a rebellion against the system of slavery on which the empire was built.
William Knibb described slavery as one of the worst things that could ever happen to human.
William Knibb came to Jamaica as a missionary at the age of 21.
So he wrote to his mother back in England that he was going to work towards ensuring that slavery would no longer exist.
And the enslaved people, how did they feel towards William Knibb?
First, they weren't trusting of William Knibb, because along comes a white man looking like the slave owner and trying to befriend them. They thought it was a trick, but William Knibb was tenacious. And soon they began to trust him. And the trust was aided by the fact that the slave owners didn't like William Knibb.
You think this rebellion had an impact on Parliament in London?
Yes, it did. It forced them to move closer towards emancipation. It gave them the feeling that, yes, if we don't give emancipation now, something worse than a rebellion is likely to happen.
In Britain, the campaign against enslavement was led by an evangelical Anglican, William Wilberforce, and taken up by others. Slavery was finally outlawed throughout the British Empire by the Abolition Act of 1833.
On that night, when the slaves were going to be freed, right here in this church, the slaves made a make-believe coffin. In it, they put the shackles, the handcuffs, the whips, and everything. As it got closer to 12 o'clock, all the 2,000 slaves gathered in and around this church, and they started at about 10 minutes to 12. The monster is dying. The monster is dying. The monster is dying. And when the clock struck 12, they all got up in unison and shouted, "The monster is dead!" And they took up that make-believe coffin and they buried that coffin.
How Parliament was persuaded over decades to abolish first the trade in human beings and then, in the face of rebellions, slavery itself, is an epic. But in the British Empire, it was the slave owners who were compensated, whilst the enslaved people, as they achieved their freedom, were left to fend for themselves on an island whose economy had depended on their servitude.
It was no longer legal for one human being to own another. But that did little to eliminate the hardships of the formerly enslaved. In many ways, their lives got worse, not better. I'm talking to historian Viront Satchel again.
Emancipation was just, well, giving the former slaves freedom in the sense that they were no longer bondsmen or they were no longer chattels. They were now seen as human beings, but they were still being treated as inferior subjects.
What sort of problems had persisted in Jamaica?
With emancipation, the slaves who had this land free for years now found themselves having to pay rent for the land as well as rent for their huts. And the wages, quote unquote, that we're getting couldn't cover all of those costs.
How would you describe the legacy of this period of slavery in Jamaica today?
Bob Marley's song, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. We are still suffering from that psychological trauma, that lack of confidence in some of us. We were, as children of enslaved people, were dragged out, ripped away from Mother Africa to the Americas. Suddenly, leaving family, friends, taking nothing with us but our cultural baggage into a strange land, in a strange culture, strange language, strange everything. You have lost part of you. I cannot say exactly where I'm from. I just can't trace that back. I don't know where in Africa, West Africa, yes, but where? Where's my village?
The British Empire uprooted millions of men and women from the continent of Africa and deposited them on the island of Jamaica. Many of their descendants would mourn their loss of identity. Some would turn to a revolutionary movement that not only rejected empire, but holds its inheritors, like me, to account.
Do you think the United Kingdom economy benefits from slavery?
You benefited from our labor.
I'm approaching a village called Pinnacle, and with this amazing panorama that's opened up over Kingston Harbour, the name is absolutely justified.
It's not just a beauty spot. It's a revolutionary hub. One that rejected the British Empire and everything that it stood for.
Before the Second World War, as the British Empire waned, a political movement grew up in Jamaica that looked to reach out to black people in Africa and elsewhere to throw off the legacy of enslavement.
The Rastafari movement established a settlement at Pinnacle under the leadership of Leonard Howell, who's sometimes known as the first Rasta. He argued that black Africans are superior to white Europeans. To enter Pinnacle, I need permission from the Council of Elders.
Africa Love, brother, thank you so much for your welcome here today to Pinnacle. Would it be possible for me to meet the elders as well, please?
Yes, man. It's possible.
Good.
It couldn't work without them. Resurrecting the name of Leonard P. Howell.
Yes.
And I'm happy to introduce real soldiers.
Brother?
For the rights.
My name is Michael. Brother, my name is Michael.
Bless up, man.
Leonard Howell's uncompromising anti-colonial message made an enemy of the authorities.
And that's Brother Constance.
Brother Constance.
As did the settlement's use of cannabis, which they saw as a sacrament.
Brother the priest.
The elders provide a living link to Leonard Howell and his original settlement.
No, I know Mr. Howell. Mr. Howell, in '54, he was raided here by the police. A lot of people go to prison. And they used to plant a lot of ganja here too. When you smoke those herbs, it gives you an inspiration. Police arrest him. They say they charge him for treason and then send him to prison. And many people here go to prison and scatter. I know a lot of them. He have the inspiration of Almighty, you know.
I'm invited to join the elders in a communal gathering overseen by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was seen as their African promised land, and its ruler, Haile Selassie, was hailed by the Rastafari as their king and biblical savior, their black messiah. In finding a new religion, they'd found a new politics too.
Leonard P. Howell said, look, I am looking for a God with new morality and new justice, because this existing system, giving its support to colonialism, slavery, and oppression, they cannot be our liberator.
I'm meeting Brother Louis, a Rastafari authority on Leonard Howell.
His approach to colonialism was not just a simple thing of getting rid of the colonial master. He went beyond it now and said, look, we need to build our own civilization.
By the wholesale rejection of British colonialism, the Rastafari were declaring independence.
These people were no longer British subjects, no, they have a new identity.
The Rastafari looked to Africa to remake their identity. But thousands of Jamaicans made a different choice, voyaging instead to the very heart of empire. In June 1948, the Empire Windrush, a former troop carrier, steamed out of Kingston Harbour, bound for Tilbury, near London. On board were several hundred people who intended to settle in the United Kingdom. The British government was concerned about labour shortages and had granted citizenship to colonial subjects. The people of the British Empire were on the move again, but this time they were headed for Britain. In the coming years, identities would shift and be remade once more.
We became the black people of Britain, meaning like America had an African population, but England never really had an African population, so Jamaicans, I think, spearheaded that.
Sister Maxine from the Pinnacle community believes that Jamaica is still being exploited today.
What you're trying to keep is your economic system.
We are.
Yeah, the British are. Economically, if you look at the wealth of Jamaica, it goes abroad. You know, the majority of Jamaicans migrate for better economic opportunity. Where is the growth if your educated masses leave?
Do you think the United Kingdom economy benefits from slavery?
You've benefited from our labor, because it's our labor. You know, we didn't come here because of race. We came here because we could withstand the sun to grow the sugar. That was the cocaine of that time. You know what I mean? Because the sugar came into the human body and everybody wanted it. You know what I mean?
How would you express the legacy for you, for Jamaicans, of the British Imperial experience?
With such a majority African population here, the majority of the economics is still held by the plantation class.
Even today?
Even today.
The capture in 1655 of a small island in the Caribbean set the British Empire on a path that would change the history of continents and the futures of millions, including the Britain that we call home today. In the next program, I'm going to explore how the lure of Africa's wealth drew the empire into a shameful war. Surviving more than 100 years, original barbed wire, and a century of racial oppression.
The idea of subordinating black people and making them into a vassal class does not start after 1948.
A century ago, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet. In this series, I will go in search of Britain's imperial past,
I have found gold.
and uncover its legacies. How did a small island on the edge of Europe end up dominating the world?
He turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates.
From its proudest achievements to its most shameful failures.
We're ripped away from Mother Africa into a strange land.
And how has the history of empire transformed Britain?
We became the black people of Britain.
On this journey, I uncover the extraordinary story of the biggest empire that the world has ever seen. In this program, I'm exploring the jewel in the crown of empire. The way that Britain established its rule here would provide a model for the globalization of today. In India, Britain's imperial power was founded upon one of the world's first great multinational companies. Unlike today's corporate giants, it exercised political power directly with guns.
This company went in for a type of exploitation that the world has not seen.
They had a divine right to rule. It was as simple as that.
Opportunities to trade and corporate greed led Britain into entanglements all over the world. But in India, those base motives were gradually converted into the pomp, grandeur, and glory of the British Raj. India has long gripped the British imagination. A vast and exotic subcontinent, home to ancient civilizations, powerful rulers, and untold riches. Here, Britain honed its imperial skills, and possessing India attracted the grudging admiration of rivals and added to British power. This is the Queen Victoria Memorial Hall, dedicated to the Empress of India. The Raj was at its pinnacle during her reign. It was, in a way, the perfection of the colonial idea, a moment when Britain was totally committed to the governance of the Queen's 300 million subjects here, and when India seemed indispensable to Britain's prestige. At the time of Queen Victoria's death in 1901, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet and 400 million people. No other possession competed with the glamour of India, with its capital at Calcutta. British authority did not originate with the state or military conquest. The father of empire in India, the man responsible for securing British power, was a businessman. He was bold, opportunistic, and visionary. Some would say a greedy villain. The back wall of these houses must be the outer wall of the Clive house. Clues about how Robert Clive led a profit-hungry corporation with its own private army to rule over millions lie hidden in these back streets. The fine brickwork of the Clive house now forms one side of that little street. Clive completely transformed Britain's role in India, but his former home now lies in ruins, all but forgotten. This filthy, rubbish-strewn passageway is now the way into the house. I don't think it was the main entrance, although there are steps left here. And the place has been taken over by crows and goodness knows what other creatures. And this must have been a spectacularly grand room where there has been some restoration, I think. Look at these wonderful classical pillars. I imagine before they were rendered and maybe made to look like marble. Clive took over a Mughal villa of a single story, and he added another one. And here you see the 2 stories. Robert Clive was the delinquent son of a minor Shropshire landowner. When he was 17, his family bought him a job in the East India Company. It had existed for more than a century, but this young firebrand would lead it to become a superpower. I found one of the present-day inhabitants. Beautiful high ceiling here. This could also have been a grand room. And here, I think, the main entrance. Very handsome flight of rounded steps. And the visitor will be confronted with this set of magnificent arches, very imposing. Clive knew how to live. The India that Clive stepped into was ruled by the Mughals. At its height, their mighty empire stretched from modern-day Afghanistan down the length of the subcontinent. They built awe-inspiring forts, mosques, and mausoleums that expressed their immense wealth and power. But in the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was fracturing, and Clive challenged its waning power with the help of the East India Company's private army. With no military training, he deployed the company's troops against the French in India. And when the Mughals occupied Calcutta, he expelled them at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. With actions like that, the company was transformed from a trading venture into a military and imperial power. And Robert Clive became the undisputed ruler of Bengal. The traders of the East India Company had ventured in search of fortunes for themselves and their shareholders in Britain. At that time, India offered a dazzling concentration of riches, representing well over a fifth of the world's wealth. Here's what lured the European powers to India: pepper, spices, silks, cottons, perfumes. The appetite for such fineries was insatiable. For 150 years, the British East India Company competed with others to win or force trading concessions from the wealthy Mughals. Jawahar Sircar is a noted historian and a former secretary of India's Ministry of Culture. How does it happen that a man who's bought his position as a clerk becomes a military leader?
He came in as a clerk and pushed his pen for 2 dull years. Didn't excite him much. But then when the battle started, he showed an extraordinary courage. He had an inbuilt suicidal streak. And that earned him more and more pips on his shoulder, and he rose very fast.
What change do you think Robert Clive brought about in the East India Company?
No one before him or after him was such a buccaneer. Without his bravado, without his excesses, without his stratagem, his cunning, his ruthlessness in getting things done, which are most untrader-like, he turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates. He turned the East India Company into a power to reckon with.
Battlefield success and backroom deals gave Clive the leverage to force an extraordinary concession from the Mughals: the right to collect Bengal's taxes. A company of traders, answerable to no one but its shareholders, now had the power of emperors. And that unleashed an era of rapacious corporate greed.
Clive made a lot of money. He would never have made that in Shropshire. They would not make it anywhere. It was mind-boggling.
For the East India Company, profit was king. As long as the corporation made money, employees were free to line their own pockets too. Clive, now one of Britain's wealthiest men, bought up grand houses back home and stuffed them with priceless Indian treasures. Company men like him also used their plundered riches to acquire political power in Britain, putting MPs on the payroll and buying elections to Parliament. Here in Bengal, the greed went unchecked.
It had disastrous consequences. 1/3 of the population of this province, which was 30 million, 1/3, that's almost 10 million people died. And the Brits are held responsible even till today.
They died how?
Starvation. Starvation. He started tampering around with natural lines of supply, storage, taxing, overtaxing, so the peasants fled their farms. It's so very much part of the psyche that we had what is called this great man-made famine.
The East India Company, after Robert Clive, the way he develops it, can you compare it to anything in our modern life?
This company went in for a type of exploitation that the world has not seen. The convergence of profit with state power, with military power, is the prototype of all transnational exploitative companies that you've seen.
The actions of the East India Company caused scandal in Britain, with parliamentarians condemning the rampant greed and corruption. The East India Company's mismanagement in Bengal sent its shares crashing. But as in the recent banking crisis, it was deemed too big to fail. It was bailed out by the government, which acquired influence over how it was run in a sort of public-private partnership. Within a year, Robert Clive was dead in mysterious circumstances. Samuel Johnson said he'd acquired his fortunes by such crimes that his consciousness of them impelled him to cut his own throat. Others have suggested that he overdosed on the highly addictive drug that would become the East India Company's most profitable commodity. Its trade would turn the company, backed by the British state, into history's biggest narcotics dealer. By the 1770s, the traders of the East India Company had laid the foundations of Britain's empire in India. Calcutta was at its heart, and its arteries of international trade reached across the globe. From the west coast of Africa, British ships carried enslaved people to the Caribbean to grow sugar for the British market. From China, East India Company ships brought the tea on which the British were hooked. But to quench Britain's growing thirst, the company needed to sell Chinese people a product they wanted to buy. The answer was a highly addictive drug grown here in Britain's Indian territories. In the opium agency of the East India Company, 2,500 clerks in 100 offices toiled to control the cultivation of the narcotic by Indian farmers, its quality and its transport to warehouses like this. The highly profitable export of a few thousand tons per year kept a swathe of China's population addicted. And when their government objected, Britain fought 2 wars rather than give up the trade. All that was about buying China tea so that the British Empire could enjoy a lovely cuppa. At the end of the 18th century, Britain appointed a Governor-General with a grand imperial plan. Richard Wellesley was a close ally of the Prime Minister William Pitt. He'd been politically ambitious at home and in India was attracted more by power than profit. Under his governorship, the East India Company's private armies marched across India, conquering vast territories and installing puppet princes. With Wellesley at the helm, this great multinational company was creating empire. Richard Wellesley was the elder brother of the man who would become the Duke of Wellington. He was responsible not only for Government House in Calcutta, but also this more personal villa of the Caesars out here at Bharatpur. The British in India ruled over regional royalty and aristocracy, leaders of great wealth who dressed flamboyantly and built palaces of extraordinary ostentation. And Wellesley believed that the imperial power should not be outdone in display. In 1801, Wellesley started building this palatial country retreat for the Governor-General, 15 miles upriver from Calcutta. A magnificent entrance, you might say, but in fact, this is simply the back door to the garden.
The principal approach, which would have been experienced by visitors, lies on the other side, where at the moment major works are underway.
Wellesley was imitating Mughal splendour, but he expressed it in an unmistakably British style.
The first thing, the scale of it. Superb proportions, wonderful tall ceilings, marbled floor. This is just the rear veranda and into the ballroom. And although from the outside it really could pass as a British stately home, I think not so inside. There are an almost uncountable number of double doors because the point was that air should flow. I should have arrived under the portico, protected from the typhoon, and then I would have come up one of these twin staircases, and then I should have arrived here in the entrance lobby. This is the proper way to enter the house.
These days, Barrackpore is home to the Bengali Police Training Academy and is being painstakingly restored by its Director General, Shoman Mitra.
Shoman, during Wellesley's tenure, what happened to the British Empire? Was it expanding?
The empire wasn't established during that time. It was part of the East India Company. But he had a vision towards that. He acquired a lot of land. He also fought a lot of wars. And I would say, while doing this, he realized if one has to control India, one has to be like a Raja or a king or a Maharaja. And that's how he built these grand palaces and mansions.
And how do you view that now? Because in a way, he was foreseeing the future of the British Empire. Indeed, he was creating the future of the British Empire.
Yes, this is one of the important markers, establishing big mansions, big houses, government houses, so that people they have come to rule are awestruck.
What did the East India Company think of that?
Oh, they were horrified. They rebuked him. They called him back in 1805 and said that we have sent you for trade. This is not what you should be doing.
You are a free nation. You are a republic. Why do you want to restore colonial history?
I'm not talking about whether colonialism was good or bad or whatever, but certainly it was a part of our shared history. And this particular building was built with the hard work of our craftsmen, Indian craftsmen. True, it might be designed by Britishers, but it's part of our shared global architecture. So how can I deny our past?
When Richard Wellesley left India, there was no mistaking that the British had assumed control. But in the subsequent decades, influential voices at home argued that it wasn't enough for the company to rule India. Their view was that the British had to civilize it too. Despite company resistance, Parliament was convinced to allow Christian missionaries into India. It would lead to tensions, especially amongst the troops on which British rule depended. The East India Company's armies consisted mainly of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. The company behaved insensitively, toppling local rulers arbitrarily and greedily, trampling on local hierarchies and customs, whilst the sepoys feared that Christian missionaries were out to destroy their religions. These issues were emotive, explosively so. Less than a mile from the Governor-General's Barrackpore retreat, one sepoy was pushed to the point of insurrection. The British introduced the Enfield rifle. To load it, the sepoy was required to bite off the end of the cartridge, which might have been greased with either pig or cow fat. One was repugnant to Muslims and the other to Hindus. On the 29th of March, 1857, a devout upper caste Hindu sepoy called Mangal Pandey, in disgust, urged his fellow soldiers to rise up in revolt, and he himself attacked two officers. Legend has it that he was hanged by the British from a banyan tree. It was an incident at the start of the year of the Indian Rebellion, an event which would prove extremely bloodthirsty and of great political significance. rebellion in the army swiftly spread to the civilians of North and Central India. For the British, the uprising of an indigenous population who greatly outnumbered them was the stuff of nightmares. Murderous attacks on Europeans were met with brutal reprisals. To understand why company rule broke down in such a shockingly violent way, I'm meeting historian Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee. What do you think were Mangal Pandit's reasons for going on his rampage?
There was the persistent and very deep fear among the sepoys that there was a full-blown conspiracy on the part of the British government to spoil the caste and the religion of the sepoys. The British government was seen to be interfering with the way people lived their lives and the way society had been held together, had been made to function for generations and centuries.
This list of insensitivities, who's to blame for this? Who is insensitive? The British government, the East India Company, the individual? Where does it come from?
These are administrators who are coming out to India and they find a society that is completely alien to them. And they think that this is an inferior civilization because they don't match up to our European standards. Therefore, it is our duty to change and civilize this people of India.
So does that mean that these people with attitudes that we now regard as appalling,
yes,
so condescending, so contemptuous, does it mean that nonetheless they could themselves have been conscientious and well-meaning?
Yes, but they were totally insensitive to what impact their policies would have on the people who were being affected by those policies. There's a mismatch there, a complete divorce between intention and consequence.
The number of people killed during the rebellion and its aftermath is almost unimaginable. 800,000 people died, the great majority of them Indians. When the news reached Britain, there was outrage at the scale of the violence. Out of this horror, a reformed empire would emerge, personified by an empress who claimed to rule India's teeming millions with the affection of a mother. The shocking violence of the Indian Rebellion shook British rule in India to its core. After a year of bloodshed, control was restored, but the British government could no longer allow the company to rule. The government removed the East India Company from control. Its corruption had long been an embarrassment, and formalized rule by the Crown. Queen Victoria would become the Empress of India, commencing the high point of the British Raj. Queen Victoria would be portrayed as mother to her subjects in India. The company's monumental buildings were repurposed, and sumptuous new ones were built, creating a capital city worthy of India's status as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. This magnificent dome, borne aloft by 28 Corinthian columns, is the old post office and a metaphor for British colonial rule. Staffed mainly by Indians, the postal service spread out across the country, bringing letter deliveries to all. After the rebellion, just 20,000 British officials and soldiers were required to run Indian civil servants and troops who administered a subcontinent of 300 million. To understand how the empire now claimed legitimacy and distanced itself from the East India Company, I'm speaking to Anthony Kachachurian, a Kolkata historian and writer. So after 1857, what would you say about the British rebooting of its empire here in India?
They had to truly start governing. It couldn't just be hoarding chests full of diamonds from the mines of Hyderabad. Queen Victoria's proclamation says, we are here to provide you with equal governance and fair play and trade for everybody. Everybody will be treated equally. We will not impose religion on you. But the giveaway is, right at the end, there are 2 or 3 words along the lines of, but don't forget, we are here to rule you because you are our subjects.
How do you think it's possible that only about 20,000 British officials and soldiers are able to administer India?
All of India, going across from what we now call Pakistan right the way across to Bangladesh, was chopped up into 250-odd districts. And they broke it down. So every district had an Indian civil services officer and a police superintendent. And these were the two left and right hands of the empire. They were the be-all and end-all for those districts.
It strikes me that the British took their imperial duties seriously in the sense that, for example, the second sons of important families in Britain would come out here for decades, they'd bring up their families here, and they would, in a way, be committed to India.
They had a supreme belief that they were sent out here by the Queen herself and God above her. They had a divine right to rule. It was as simple as that.
Towards the end of Queen Victoria's reign, a man took charge determined to exhibit the splendours of the Raj. George Nathaniel Curzon came from an old aristocratic family, and in India he would perfect the empire's display in the most grandiose way. This footage from 1911 shows the scale of the Delhi Durbars, a spectacular imperial pageant pioneered by him in 1903.
It's a huge, huge statement. Curzon is trying to put across that the age of rapacity, of loot, have now ended. Now it is about the King Emperor ruling India. It's about governance. This is the grand statement that all of you kings and maharajas from across the country come down here on bended knee and accept the right of the King Emperor to rule across the country in harmony.
Curzon would also give an old company institution a new lease of life. At Barrackpore, the viceroys and their families could take their leisure in an exclusive British enclave. Calcutta was then the capital of British India. That meant an immense area, including even present-day Burma. And so from here was ruled an enormous number of human beings. And to this place came people from all over the empire. So would I be right in thinking this is the ballroom?
Yes, it is. It is a ballroom with, as you can see, a sprung floor.
Historian Manabi Mitra has researched the rarefied world of Barrackpore when it was home to the empire's leaders at play.
It was probably one of the most celebrated ballrooms of British India because everybody who was somebody and was close enough to merit the Viceroy's attention came here. We have people like Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill, George V, as well as royalty and nobility from all across Europe.
And here's a rather surprising item. A fireplace. Would you need such a thing here?
Barrackpore was an approximation of home. It was a grafting of a piece of Little England on an Indian territory. So I suppose the fireplace was used as a reminder that here was a little slice of England.
These photographs capture the British in India when they were off duty. They show a world of characteristically British pursuits, the lifestyle of Britain's upper classes transplanted to Asia. But how did the Raj's rulers relate to the India all around them?
So what we have here is a typical round of tiffin, which would have the usual fish dish and the meat dish, but done in a little different way. This is roast lamb, as you can see. Should I serve you some?
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, and this looks delicious. What is this?
Yes, this is mulligatawny soup. It's soup made with lentils and chicken broth.
Delightful.
All right.
Today I'm being served a tiffin lunch, the kind of food that would have been enjoyed by the Raj's top brass and their guests. I'm going to try the mulligatawny. In their social life, did the British ever invite Indians here?
The thing about Government House Barrackpore was that it was kind of a sacred, inviolable zone where only friends would be invited.
But waited upon hand and foot by Indians,
Oh, yes.
I assume.
Yes. In all the photographs that we have seen of dining under the banyan tree, we see an army of babachis and khidmat cars and servers standing behind in full regalia, but always to wait upon the sahibs.
What about the Indians, as it were, on the outside, who probably couldn't even see in? What did they feel about this way of life?
In this park, there are two portions. One is the private portion and the public portion. And in the public portion, people were allowed in. So they were allowed to have a glimpse of the park.
They could come and gape at the imperial markers, and they could look at them approvingly.
The British in India were always a tiny minority. The imperial institutions that they created allowed them to rule over a vast population. But a challenge to British supremacy was brewing within one of the institutions that had made the Raj a success. Trams started running in Calcutta in 1901. The British famously covered India in railway tracks, built for their own purposes, of course, but nonetheless a useful legacy of infrastructure. The colonists also decided that they needed a broad class of Indian educated to be the administrators of the empire. But of course, such educated civil servants would form the nucleus of those looking for self-government and later demanding independence. Then, in 1905, Curzon made a controversial decision with long-lasting consequences for the empire in India. Bengal was India's largest province, with a population of 85 million people. Curzon decided it would be easier for the British to rule if it was split into two. He partitioned it, along religious lines, with the western province being majority Hindu and the eastern being majority Muslim. The British decision to partition Bengal was met with massive anger. From these riverbanks, the writer Rabindranath Tagore led a great procession declaring a day of national mourning. India was set on the path of peaceful but wounding protest.
This song played the key role in the partition of Bengal around 1905. The Nobel laureate Tagore, he composed this song because this song was written as a poem in the mid-19th century.
Musicians Surendra Malik and Sumyajit Das come from old Kolkata families.
Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Phulla kusumita drumadal shobhini, Suhasini.
What he was saying was that you can't have your mother split into two. The country should not be split into two. It was a song which brought Hindus, Muslims, everyone together on the streets and gave them the power to fight.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful voice you have and how well you play. How did you both feel performing that?
It has a lot of bloodshed involved in it, passion of people to get their motherland for them. So it's not just a song for us. It gives a big goosebump whenever we perform this.
What was Tagore's view of the British Raj?
I think from 1905 and the partition of Bengal, because he quite understood the political game that was happening of not only splitting the land of India, but splitting the major religion of India. You know, the Muslims that way and the Hindus this way, and in a way dividing them to rule them.
British people would probably think, the struggle for Indian independence, Gandhi. But all of the things we've been talking about, or most of them, while Gandhi is still in South Africa. So for you, is Tagore as big a figure, maybe a bigger figure in the movement as Gandhi?
Yes. The partition had hurt Bangladesh and India, the two parts of Bengal. So these were the places which created the platform for the Nehrus, Gandhis, and the faces of the movement to stand where they are today.
The British reversed their decision and reunited Bengal in 1911. But their insensitivity had launched India's independence movement. When the empire was drawn into the Great War, Indians offered their support, but demanded new freedoms. For centuries, Mughal India was one of the world's great powers. It controlled a fifth of the world's wealth. But that changed when the British came. I've entered a factory that sounds like the 19th century and looks like a Renaissance painting. These beautiful shafts of light which are illuminating the dust which is everywhere in the air. In 19th century India, factories like this were rare. At that time, Britain was the workshop of the world. And India's once thriving economy had been reduced to a supplier of raw materials for British factories. For Robert Clive, cotton was one of the great riches of India. But then jute, a versatile and cheap crop which had been used for millennia, was found to have new uses for rope, for sacking, and as a backing for linoleum. During the First World War, Britain needed India to ramp up its manufacturing output. Bengali jute production went into overdrive for sandbags and tarpaulins in the trenches. And 1.4 million Indians answered Britain's call to arms. India's tremendous sacrifice for empire emboldened it to make demands. When Britain went to war in 1914, it summoned forces from across the empire, hugely boosting the numbers that could be deployed. Indians fought tenaciously for empire, but also with future freedom in mind. For why should not India gain as its reward the same self-government by then enjoyed by Australia and Canada? In the Great War, Britain promised India self-government. But in its aftermath, those promises were broken. Then a terrible massacre occurred in Amritsar. In this place, called the Jallianwala Bagh, British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians gathered in peaceful protest. The slaughter was a turning point for many Indians, convincing them that they must break free. Well, how did Indians feel when in 1939, yet again, the British Empire asked them to go and fight?
In 1939, the situation was much more complex.
Kashik Roy is a professor of military history.
The political class, they are more clever, that it should not be 1919 again. Then that's why the Congress said that Britain must declare a date for independence. Otherwise, Congress would not give support.
What is the view towards the First World War of Mohandas Gandhi, and what is his view towards the Second World War?
Between First World War and Second World War, Gandhi's view completely, transformed. He said, don't believe the British. The British will again go back to their promises as they have done after First World War. Nobody could really trust Britain.
In World War II, Britain once again mobilized the empire, despite resistance from Indian leaders. Indian troops would play a crucial role in the Allies' victory. But even as Indian soldiers fought in theaters of war across the globe, here in Bengal, a catastrophic famine brought death to millions. How important is the Bengal famine of 1943 in the story of India?
It is our Holocaust. I mean, everybody knows about the Jewish Holocaust, but very few in the world knows about the Bengal Holocaust. engineered by the British. So much so,
That's your view, that it was engineered by the British?
Yeah. It was structural because whatever food was there in Bengal, it had to be sucked out to feed the army. Remember, imperialism mostly depended not merely on brute force, but also on confidence, moral legitimacy. So that completely washed away.
With the broken promise to India over Home Rule and the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, and later with the famine during the wartime in Bengal, British trustworthiness, legitimacy and prestige bled away, and Indian non-violence became unstoppably victorious. Britain partitioned India from Pakistan and gave them both independence in 1947. In the 7 decades since, India has rediscovered its power and has become a global economic force once more. But how does it deal with its history of subjugation? When you look back at the British in Indian history, the fact that Indians were not allowed at the top table, the massacre at Amritsar, the famine in Bengal, are these still things that really rankle?
They do rankle in some minds, especially in people who were directly affected by these things.
Jayanta Sengupta is curator of the Victoria Memorial Hall, the most visited monument in Kolkata and the most visible relic of its British past.
But by and large, I think we have come to terms with that. And the British rule, notwithstanding how exploitative and how brutal the empire was, is part of our being, is part of our soul. And we carry it with acceptance and tolerance.
How do the British, in their long time in India, change India?
If you look at the economic impact of how the British ruled India, the industries, the artisanal industries declined. It was reduced to a raw material producing country geared to the British colonial interests.
Those who want to put the best gloss on British rule talk about good administration, railways, justice, education, a single language. What do you make of those things?
These things were created in order to serve the interests of the empire. But if it was not a part of good governance in the colonial period, it has given us a legacy which we have shaped to our best interests over the long run. The Indians took it on and then made it into an expression of India's democracy.
Britain came to India to exploit it. The East India Company looted its wealth and toppled its rulers. The Indian lived as a second-class citizen in his own country. But British colonial rule brought together 2,000 ethnic groups in a single country and gave it a unifying language and infrastructure and government and systems of law and education. The India of today, the world's largest democracy, one of its largest economies, is inevitably the product of the relationship between India and Britain. A number of India's industries have boomed and become multinationals, heavily invested in the British economy. Today, as India's wealth grows, it's easier to understand that this subcontinent was once a repository of riches. In the next program, I discover how Britain's empire was built by pirates.
They were given permission from the King of England to plunder, and plunder they did.
How millions were ripped from their homelands and stripped of their identities.
I cannot say exactly where I'm from. I just can't trace that back.
A century ago, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet. In this series, I will go in search of Britain's imperial past.
I have found gold.
And uncover its legacies. How did a small island on the edge of Europe end up dominating the world?
He turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates.
From its proudest achievements to its most shameful failures.
We're ripped away from Mother Africa into a strange land.
And how has the history of empire transformed Britain?
We became the black people of Britain.
On this journey, I uncover the extraordinary story of the biggest empire that the world has ever seen. In this program, the fate of the empire hangs in the balance as a continent is engulfed by war. Almost 250 years ago, 13 American colonies went to war with their British rulers to throw off the shackles of the old world, for equality, for the right to bear arms. Their revolutionary ideas shape the United States to this day. But just over the water in Canada, the colonists remained loyal till the end of empire, indeed beyond. I want to investigate why British rule produced armed rebellion in one territory and bound the other tightly to the crown. How the dream of a new England was swept away by the greatest rebellion in British history.
We became radicalized and decided we had to take matters into our own hands.
There are these mobs who are attacking loyalists. Loyalists attack back.
And how a new vision of empire rose from the ashes.
He was looking to import the British class structure.
This country was built on the backs of these children.
A tale of two Americas that reshaped the world. The United States of America. A vast country rich in natural resources and abundant farmlands. The British Crown's early imperial adventure here brought it wealth and prestige from 13 colonies.
400 years ago, just over 100 people set out from England with a bold new idea. They would build a new England in the New World, transplanting English society, culture and language onto American soil. They would build the first English settler colonies outside the British Isles, beginning the spread of people and ideas that would transform the world.
Over the next 150 years, settlers would fan out from Virginia across the east coast of North America, in time creating the most populous white settler colonies in the empire. But in the summer of 1776, Britain's American adventure was under threat. A year earlier, growing tensions between the 13 colonies and their imperial government had sparked all-out rebellion and a war for independence. And on the 4th of July, 1776, the insurgents declared their freedom from the iniquities of empire. The brilliant prose of their radical declaration of independence has echoed down the centuries.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. That these united colonies are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. When this declaration was read out in Manhattan, it caused a commotion.
This was a profound rejection of their British roots by the American revolutionaries. Not just of imperial control, but also the foundations of the old world: class, aristocracy, and monarchy.
so fired up were the Patriots that an enraged mob rushed here to Bowling Green and demolished the statue of King George and severed its royal head. This was regicide, in effigy at least.
The Empire responded by setting sail for New York with a gargantuan expeditionary force.
Describe to me the situation in New York, let's say at the beginning of 1776.
Well, there's a great amount of agitation going on throughout the streets over the Revolutionary War, which has already started.
Kevin Baker is a New York historian and writer.
There's a lot of violence in the streets, the Sons of Liberty who are up in arms for independence, yet there are quite a few loyal citizens to the crown as well. And there are these mobs who are attacking loyalists. Loyalists attack back. They're tar and feathering tax collectors.
And then an American Revolutionary Army establishes some sort of control, does it?
Yes, early on they come in, they realize New York is sort of the key to the continent here. And they're a huge nuisance in many ways. They're roistering about, they're getting drunk, they're brawling in the streets. So it's sort of a mess.
Yes.
And then people start to flee the city. New York was a city of about 25,000, and by the summer, only about 5,000 New Yorkers are left in town. Everybody else has taken off.
How extraordinary.
If I'd walked these streets in 1776, I'd have seen a city simmering with discontent. New York's taverns were breeding grounds for revolutionary plots and conspiracies.
The Francis Tavern, with its distinctive Dutch yellow brick, has stood here since 1719. As American discontent with imperial rule grew, a rebellious group, much associated with the Boston Tea Party, held its secret meetings here, the Sons of Liberty.
Scott McWhinney and Charles Mackenzie are descended from men who fought against the British Empire in the War of Independence.
So, gentlemen, how would you summarize the cause that motivated your ancestors?
I think initially we wanted to be as British as you guys. We consider ourselves Englishmen, and when we felt that our rights were not being recognized, then we became radicalized and decided we had to take matters into our own hands, form our own government.
It's quite an evolution of thought, isn't it? From saying that you want to be like an Englishman, as you put it, to saying that you want to abolish class, the aristocracy, the monarchy. That's quite a shift.
We don't have an aristocracy here. We have an American dream where people are included in rising up in society.
I think pushing away from nobility was easy for us. I think pushing away from our British heritage was a lot more difficult.
Tell me about the activities of the Sons of Liberty. A fair amount of violence was involved, was it not?
Originally, the Sons of Liberty were actually mostly upper middle class, the wealthy. In a bid to create a wider movement, they began holding rallies. The upper classes discovered they could not control these rallies and events. They would start marching to City Hall, they would start throwing rocks into Loyalist windows, start tearing down statues, so they may have bitten off a bit more than they could chew.
I should introduce myself as a solid member of the British establishment. How do you feel about sharing your cups with me today?
This has been lovely. It's been fantastic. If I could suggest a toast to the two Georges, George III and General George Washington.
Ah!
Cheers.
To the King and the first President.
Yes.
Back in the summer of 1776, I wouldn't have been having a friendly drink with New York's Sons of Liberty. They were intent on throwing off imperial rule, repelling the mighty weight of empire hurled against them.
The British moved to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. The Royal Navy established control over the narrows that lead into New York Harbor and landed a force of 32,000 men on the sparsely populated Staten Island. They would then move across these waters to Brooklyn and Manhattan to secure this vital port for the British for the duration of the war.
The British onslaught recovered New York City for the Empire. But George Washington's army of revolutionaries was allowed to escape. The British now faced a much harder struggle to identify loyal friends amongst communities that were bitterly divided, to win hearts and minds, and to outwit the enemy in a secret war where a mistake meant death. November 1776. The American War of Independence is in full swing. New York City stands as a bastion of empire in the 13 colonies, but it's surrounded by hostile forces.
When the British took New York City, the citizens had to decide where their allegiances lay. Most of those who supported the revolution, the self-styled patriots, left town, headed towards their side strongholds in the direction of New England. But some chose to remain behind, hiding their feelings.
I've traveled from New York City, halfway along Long Island, to East Setauket. Nominally under British control, but just a short boat ride away from the revolutionaries in New England, this sleepy backwater was the front line of the Empire's battle for American loyalty, and a hotbed of espionage and covert operations. In those days, Brewster House lay just off the King's Highway.
This is profoundly historic. In fact, this house goes back to before the American Revolution, about 100 years before the American Revolution. This became a tavern frequented by British officers, maybe British soldiers. And you can imagine them lifting their tankards of beer with an amazing fireplace.
But this tavern was also frequented in secret by the infamous Culper spy ring, an underground network of rebel agents who listened out for British military secrets.
A little garret. But actually, large numbers of people would have slept in this space. Gathered around this, it's the chimney breast, giving its welcome warmth in winter. And as they lay here, they would have heard drifting up from below the alcohol-fueled gossip of the military in their cups.
This was a small new country, mostly rural, going up against the best trained, best equipped army on the planet. So everything depended on intelligence.
Henry Schlesinger is an expert in the history of American espionage from the War of Independence to the War on Terror.
Was General George Washington in control of this espionage activity?
Yes. George Washington did look after every detail. He was meticulous in what he wanted. He called New York the fountain of all intelligence. In New York City, they're assembling spy networks of citizen spies. Many of them formed what we call in America commercial covers or commercial fronts. Hercules Mulligan was a tailor down on Lower Manhattan, and he would fit all of the British soldiers with uniforms. And as he fit them, he would pump them for information subtly. Next door was a woman named Patience Wright, who had a sculpture studio. And as she sculpted them in wax, she would pump them for information also, and ship the information back in the wax heads that she made.
Amazing.
The Culper spy ring provided crucial support, smuggling British military secrets to George Washington's Revolutionary Army. To find out how they relayed them across this body of water, I'm taking a lesson in spycraft from Kayla Cheshire.
Why are we putting up a washing line by the shore?
This was a critical part of the Culper spy ring. Anna Smith Strong was a woman in Setauket. She would physically be watching the waters, and she would hang specific laundry items to signal that this is the location that's safest for them to come and share their information or pass on information.
Okay, so we've put out some kind of message here.
Yes.
Black means come ashore.
Yep, it's safe.
And this means?
You're going to location number 3.
Someone is out there watching with a telescope.
Right. Or somebody is watching from their house, their neighborhood. So they both know.
So this was a daily activity that any woman in those days might have engaged in.
Every member of the spy ring did something that was absolutely normal, totally not suspicious.
How dangerous was this activity for the spies?
You paid with your life. Nathaniel Hale would be hung in 1776. He would be caught red-handed with his information that he was passing on to General Washington and would be put to death, not even put on trial, hung.
The choice between staying loyal to the empire or betraying it for the cause of independence was a question of life and death.
Through the vestibule of the house. And this is where the house becomes intriguing. The cupboard. What could be more innocent? Secret door. And beyond, a void. Just enough room to hide a package, or maybe some explosive, or a gun.
In those uneasy times, the British couldn't know for sure whose side this tavern's landlord, Joseph Brewster, had chosen. Gloria Rocchio is president of the Ward Melville Heritage Organization that owns Brewster House.
In these communities on Long Island, what was the sentiment during the Revolutionary War?
It was pretty tough. So they would all have to sign a document that they were loyal to the Crown. And they may be not loyal to the Crown. You know, no one comes out and says, I'm a spy. We've done a lot of research about Joseph Brewster. And you see, frankly, he wasn't really loyal to the Crown, in our opinion.
Brewster was just sort of hanging around, and while he was clearing up the mugs or whatever, he'd be listening.
Or his wife, you know, serving them. And then the both of them listening and transferring that information. And why not? It was smart to do it. He found out information for the Patriots, and he protected his goods and his family.
This spy ring, how significant do you think it was in its achievements?
I think it was very significant. We couldn't outfight you. We outsmarted you. Sorry.
The Culper spy ring would continue to operate for the duration of the war, undermining the empire from within. To understand the mood in British-occupied Manhattan, as the war seemed to be turning in the rebels' favor, I'm talking to Kevin Baker again.
The British occupation is terrible. First off, about a quarter to a third of the town burns down in the taking of it. And after that, you have these British soldiers who are regularly pillaging, raping. About 1/5 of the city's women are reduced to prostitution. People are reduced to living in what's called Canvas Town, which is this sort of vast tent city near the ruins of Trinity Church. So it's really a miserable time. However, a lot of loyalists from around the colonies do flee to the city because this is where they get sanctuary from the rebels. These are people who are still loyal to the crown, and they're trying to escape the depredations of patriots who are persecuting them and seizing their houses and their land and trying to kill them in other parts of America.
How is opinion changing in New York during the war?
Well, this becomes, you know, a huge strain on people there, even for those who really support the crown. The British strategy in North America is uncannily like the American strategy in Vietnam, constantly marching from one sort of comfortable stronghold, one city to another, Boston to New York to Philadelphia and back. They're not doing anything to win over the hearts and minds of the people, and that's eventually what defeats them here as much as anything.
Britain continued to lose on the battlefield too. And when 8,000 of its soldiers surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, the American War of Independence was effectively over. From New York City, the exodus of those loyal to the empire began. Over the next 2 years, tens of thousands were evacuated from the city on Royal Navy ships. And on the 25th of November 1783, a triumphant George Washington re-entered the city. British New York had fallen.
On this site, the first US Congress sat, and George Washington was sworn in as first president. The loss of the colonies was a tremendous blow to British prestige, but it was not the end of the empire in North America. As its political refugees fled north, they helped to solidify the Crown's control over a vast area where Britain had recently defeated France, Canada.
The way that Britain secured and extended its rule in Canada would bring freedom for some, but there was a huge cost for Native Americans. Britain's loss of its 13 American colonies provoked a great movement of people. Tens of thousands joined the flight north to what remained of Britain's North American empire. The Niagara River divided the new United States of America from British North America, the territories of the Crown in what is today Canada. The Lion and the Unicorn, supporters of the British Crown, have made their way across the globe, including here to Fort Niagara. Fort Niagara's British garrison gave aid to American Loyalist refugees fleeing into British territory at the war's end.
Dining room with lake view. I think the officers knew how to live well. Quite a luxurious, spacious room, I think. Huh. With locks on the outside. No, it's a jail.
This fort in upstate New York was allowed to remain briefly in British hands at the end of the War of Independence.
I'm here on a beautiful autumn's day, but even so, the wind comes off Lake Ontario and it's quite chilly. The Loyalists who gathered here came during one of the worst winters on record. It was freezing, there was snow all about, and nothing makes you tireder, hungrier, sicker than defeat. Their conditions must have been simply appalling.
Although the Revolutionary War had been the Empire's fight, most of the people who passed through here fleeing to sanctuary were not of British descent. As the war progressed, Native Americans, who were the 13 colonies' original inhabitants, picked sides and joined the fight. Rick Hill's Mohawk and Tuscarora ancestors were among those torn apart.
So when the American Revolution comes, what kind of problem does that pose for your peoples?
It created a big problem because we had to decide who are we going to support. Our people were divided into two. Our families are divided.
Literally down the middle?
Even to the point where my dad's Mohawk relatives fought against my mother's Tuscarora relatives. They shed each other's blood.
Well, now we're approaching Fort Niagara, and an important chapter is played out here.
And so many of the decisions made inside that wall profoundly impacted on our lives. And still, today, I think we suffer the consequences of that.
The Mohawk were famous and feared warriors who'd fought with the British before. When it came to choosing sides, one of their political leaders had a clear vision of what role they should play in the war.
Joseph Brant was tutored to be an ally of the British. He went to church when he was very young. He could read and write in English. He had a Mohawk heart. But he also fell in love with the crown, fell in love with the idea of England. And so he was a staunch, loyal supporter of the crown for many years. When they had a meeting here to try to decide, are we going to support the British or the Americans, Brant said, we have an obligation to fight on behalf of the king.
But siding with the British would have disastrous consequences for Rick's ancestors. General George Washington ordered his army to use scorched earth tactics against them. More than 40 villages were razed and crops destroyed, sending thousands fleeing their homelands. And those Native Americans were not allowed back into the United States even after the war's end.
When Great Britain agreed to the treaty to settle the Revolutionary War, they gave away our land to the Americans without talking to us. The land from which we derive our identity, which we have this spiritual relationship to, that was harmed by the American Revolutionary War and the loss of land.
Did your ancestors, those who have been living in what was now to be the United States, move off into what was to become Canada?
Joseph Brant negotiated the fact that we would have this large swath of land along the Grand River. So we live on that land today.
So looking back over all this turmoil and division, how do your peoples tend to regard the British based on this period?
I'll try to give an answer that's not X-rated. We have a love-hate relationship with the British. We're not British subjects. We've never been conquered. We've got through many difficulties together. We've fought many wars together, and we remain loyal to our alliance.
Of the countless refugees who crossed the border into the empire in the decades after the war, many sought freedom. The American revolutionaries had declared that all men were created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, including liberty. But that did not apply to enslaved people. And after the revolution, the United States clung to human bondage, just as the British Empire began to dismantle it. At that time, slavery was legal throughout the empire. But in British North America, as in Britain itself, there was a growing movement to end it. In 1793, Upper Canada led the way, with a law that guaranteed freedom to any US slave who managed to escape across the border. It would still take 41 years to eradicate slavery in the Canadian colonies, but increasingly, Canada offered a moral rebuke to the United States and a magnet to its enslaved people. Hello, Skipper. Tens of thousands of enslaved people of African descent would make the dangerous journey from America to Upper Canada in secret. Here, almost 170 years ago, Leslie Harper Wells's ancestors crossed to freedom. The British Empire carries a heavy burden of guilt for existing on slavery for so long, but then it abolishes the slave trade and slavery within the British Empire.
It's interesting to me how when we came to Canada, one of our churches we chose was African Methodist Episcopal. In 1851, we changed the name of the church to British Methodist Episcopal. So in some ways, I think we kind of forgave you Brits for what happened.
And it's one of the reasons, if that's true, that you forgave the Brits, that the fact that the British Empire had abolished slavery made a real difference to people.
Made a difference. Absolutely, for finally recognizing the ills of your ways, I suppose.
Tell me about the experiences in your own family.
There were 2 brothers and a 9-year-old sister that came from Kentucky. I believe it's 1,500 miles, approximately. And at one point, the 3 of them had fallen asleep, but something woke the boys up and frightened them, and they took off like a shot. And they got about a quarter of a mile away before they realized they had left the 9-year-old sister sleeping in a log. Many people might have said, no, we can't go back, we'll die too. We love our sister, but we have to leave her. No, they didn't do that. They went back and got her.
So 3 very young members of your family made it to freedom. What do you think it meant to
Oh, can you imagine? Like what they had been through, and now they were free.
But to what kind of country were they escaping? Of the thousands of refugees who'd moved north in the wake of the American Revolution, the great majority were loyalists of British descent.
I could be in the grounds of a British stately home, but in fact, Dundurn Castle stands only about 60 miles from Fort Niagara, across the border into Canada. The loss of those 13 American colonies was a disaster for Britain. And in its wake, the British Empire consolidated and expanded its presence to the north. As the first Lieutenant Governor of the colony of Upper Canada put it, a little Britain will be built in the wilderness.
In the decades after the war, British North America took shape out of a handful of colonies, including the former French territories of Lower Canada and the land around the Great Lakes, then called Upper Canada. In the 1830s, the son of a Scottish veteran of the Revolutionary War built this grand home.
Castle Dundurn. Dundurn, chosen for its Scottish ring, no doubt. Maybe calling it a castle a bit of an exaggeration for a house with 40 rooms, but it's nicely done. This tiling I've seen in the House of Commons in London, and this is a beautiful sweeping stair, all done to impress. Very nice.
The owner, Alan Napier McNabb, was a man on the make, a lawyer, property speculator, and railway magnate with political ambitions.
In the grand house, I've now, of course, descended below stairs. Typical upstairs, downstairs construction. And here, the ceilings are low. It's a brick floor replacing the rugs and the tiles of the grand rooms upstairs. Sculleries. Presumably where the servants were allowed to take their meals. The whole house constructed absolutely on the model of the British stately home.
It appears that the British class system rejected by the American revolutionaries was sustained here. To find out why it might have been important to the son of an Empire loyalist, I'm meeting heritage manager Ian Kerr-Wilson.
He was an individual who was trying to associate with the political elites of what is now Ontario. And he was one of those people who was looking to import the British class structure, the idea of the local squire of the town. And to do that, of course, he had to establish a certain, shall we say, brand, which was, in this case, a big grand country home, complete with, grand dining room and grand hall.
Why do you think he would want to express Britishness in architecture and lifestyle?
He was aspiring to be seen as part of the upper class, and so you had to have all the trappings of that. I mean, this is very much the frontier in the 1820s and 1830s, and so you could make yourself who you needed to be.
Was it preordained that Canada would import a British class system?
Absolutely not. There was a whole other political movement that was very strong in this era, which was very much based on the American ideas of republicanism and classless society. So McNabb's big political rival ultimately led a rebellion to try and overthrow this idea of a class-based political system.
50 years after the Americans won their independence, both Upper and Lower Canada were engulfed in turmoil, when critics of the colonial system rose in armed revolt. Alan McNabb served in a military unit sent to put the rebellion down. Determined not to repeat the mistakes made in America, Britain gradually conceded greater self-rule to the Canadian colonies. And McNabb was knighted for his efforts in defending the empire. Several years later, he would receive the ultimate stamp of approval.
So this is actually a very, very early photograph of the Prince of Wales, Edward VII, visiting McNabb, visiting Dundurn in September of 1860.
An unrecognizably svelte Prince of Wales, who later became Edward VII.
Now, was there, as it were, a royal policy of visiting Canada?
This was actually pretty unprecedented at this time. There was a lot of concern about the American influence in the colony. And so having the royal family come out to basically shore up the idea that the Crown was supportive of the growth and expansion of this colony, I think was a very explicit sort of thing.
It must have been fantastic for MacNab, looking at the history of Canada, as the royal family felt it convenient to come from time to time to Canada to show the flag, to show themselves, to reinforce the bond.
Yes, absolutely. It has a good example is just how much enthusiasm there was a few years ago when the Prince of Wales showed up, and we literally filled this entire front yard. They're very well received.
To understand how the Canadian colonies built a connection with Britain that endures to this day, I'm talking to Professor Cecilia Morgan.
What role does immigration from Britain play during the 19th century in Canada?
Oh, I think a very great and a significant role. You have people who bring values, institutions, cultural practices with them to Upper Canada. So I think that represents a sort of a remaking of Britain in various kinds of ways. Not a direct replica, of course, but in terms of their notion of Britain as homeland in certain ways, transfers with them across the Atlantic. And that continues throughout the 19th century.
Is this entirely accidental, or is there any kind of British Empire policy about immigration?
It's sort of a little bit of both. But I think what happens in Britain is that immigration is no longer seen as a sign of failure. You know, you're not being shipped off to Australia as a convict. You're choosing something that's going to improve your lot in life.
By the early 19th century, what had started with a small band of pilgrims dreaming of a new England was growing into a mass movement, a human migration on a vast scale that would empower the new world. The British Empire produced one of the largest ever movements of humanity. Between 1815 and 1930, close to 19 million left the British Isles to build new lives overseas, building British power and influence across the globe. Many headed for the Empire's white settler colonies. 2.4 million went to Australia and New Zealand, almost 1 million to southern Africa, and more than 4 million to the biggest white settler colony of them all, Canada. The British made a big impact on Canada, both personally and through their descendants. Most migrants departed from Britain willingly to seek a better life for themselves. It represents one of the great migrations of history. Emigration to the colonies was encouraged by the British government, and Canada, with its vast and underpopulated territories, was in need of a new generation of settlers who could seed Britishness across the nation. Some of those who came to plant the flag were not old enough to have made the choice for themselves.
Ali, tell me about your father, Henry.
He was born in 1901 in Newcastle upon Tyne in England. His mother died in 1908. She was 28.
Yeah.
And this is my dad here. And so he would have been 7 there, and that's his middle brother and his little brother. And this is his mother's family that they were sent to take care of them.
Ali Thompson's father was one of the many who was sent out from children's homes in Britain to work as domestic servants or farm labourers in Canada.
Dad had never spoken about it, so he wrote a letter. He said after a few years of living with the aunties, we heard them say that we've got to put the boys in a home. They told us we were going on a railway trip. So I said to Auntie May, "Are you going with us?" And she said, "Yes." So we 3 went to the train station together. The guard came out and said, "Are these the boys?" And my auntie said yes. So we got up on the train and looked back saying to Auntie, "Are you coming with us?" And she said, "No." So we 3 started to cry. We're sitting on the seats and our feet never touched the ground. They were so tiny.
Yeah, but the trickery that's involved, all the deceit. How would you ever trust another adult after that?
Exactly, exactly.
When the train pulled into London, Henry and his 2 brothers were taken to a children's home, where they would live for the next 3 years.
How does he get to Canada?
They put him on a ship, the Empress of Britain, And they arrived in Canada to Halifax, went by train to Toronto, into the Fagan's distribution home, and then from there, they were sent to the farmers. And they were indentured then for at least 3 years, and they had to stay with their farmer.
Was he well treated?
Unfortunately not. He was kept in the barn, he wasn't allowed in the house. They were supposed to have education, and he unfortunately did not have any education. So the first year he was supposed to get $10. And as far as I know, he didn't receive any monies.
So you think the experiences of his childhood cast a shadow over his entire life?
Yes, I really believe that. I mean, it was especially hard for these little boys being so far from their home.
Yeah.
Being put with strangers and not having contacts with your family, and the brothers not knowing where they were. It really did upset him.
What kind of memory did he have of England? Was he fond of England, or was he repelled by England?
He honestly didn't speak a lot about it, but he had a yearning for it. He had a yearning for his mother that had died young, but he also became a very proud Canadian.
More than 100,000 children were shipped across the Atlantic by British philanthropic organizations between 1860 and 1948. Their work was backed by the British state. One organization boasted that it was turning nobody's children into empire builders. Today, about 10% of Canadians are descended from these children. Laurie Olszewski is Chief Executive of British Home Children in Canada. Her mother and grandmother were both child migrants.
These children are now known in Canada as our nation builders because they effectively did that. This country was built on the backs of these children. You know, we had a lot of abuses. We've had a lot of deaths. We had a lot of children that didn't survive. But in the long run, the vast majority of these children did survive. And they did go on to create their own families and to make valuable contributions to our country.
Whatever the wrongs of the situation, do you think the arrival of so many of these British children has had an effect in making Canada more English than it otherwise would be?
Absolutely it did. They had an enormous impact on our country, these children. And when you think about the descendants as well, too, it's an incredible impact that they had.
The idea of a New England that inspired the first settlers to sail for America 4 centuries ago created a connection with the British Isles that has not been erased by revolution, war, or the end of empire. The American revolutionaries may have rejected the mother country, but the world's largest economy and most formidable military power emerged from a political philosophy that was British. In this series, I've encountered legacies of Britain's empire across the world. In America, a love of liberty. In Canada, infrastructure and functioning institutions. But in India and South Africa, the empire was built on a racial hierarchy, and in Jamaica, on slavery.
They had a divine right to rule.
They could do as they pleased. And they did.
This wasn't empty land that was taken over. It was stolen from the indigenous people.
I've been struck by the generosity of the people that I've met.
Delightful.
Who acknowledge the importance of our shared history.
It has given us a legacy which we have shaped to our best interests.
Nations have built empires throughout history. The British was the biggest ever, and so is held uniquely responsible for what it bequeathed. So be it, as long as its achievements are judged alongside its crimes, and by the standards of its time, not only today's.